The sun had barely lifted above the horizon, casting a burnt gold light over the dry, dust-choked streets of the frontier town. Timbered buildings leaned slightly to one side, their boards weathered by relentless wind and sun. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the faint temps of the nearby river, carrying whispers of the day's coming trouble. Life here was simple, rigid, and unyielding. People moved with the cautious rhythm of those who knew every corner held danger, whether from bandits, wild animals, or the untamed land beyond the town limits. At the edge of the wooden main street, a young woman stood trembling, her hands gripping the hem of her plain dress. Her hair, dark as the midnight sky, tumbled in wild waves down her back. Her eyes, wide and desperate, scanned the distant horizon. She could hear the soft clatter of horse hooves in the distance, hear voices carried faintly by the wind. But it was the shadow that fell across the street that made her heart pound faster. She was alone, but not for long. He had come for her. The Apache appeared as if he had risen from the very earth itself. Strong, silent, and formidable, he walked with a controlled intensity that demanded attention. His movements were deliberate, every step measured. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore the kind of intensity that had earned him respect and fear alike. Stories of his skill in the wild, of his uncanny ability to find what was lost and protect what mattered, had traveled far beyond the borders of the land he roamed. Yet here, standing before her, the stories seemed to pale in comparison to the presence he carried. Like a force of nature unwilling to be ignored, she had seen him from afar before, in the market and at the edge of town, always watching, always near, but never speaking. There was an unspoken code between them, one she could not name but felt deeply in the pit of her stomach. Her life had been ordinary until now, bound by the predictability of chores, the expectations of others, the quiet monotony of frontier life. But something about him stirred a fire she could neither explain nor contain. And now, facing him directly, she felt that fire blaze hotter than ever. "Take me with you," she cried, her voice breaking with urgency. "I'm yours." The words tumbled out before she could think, raw and unrestrained. The town seemed to still around her. Even the wind held its breath. Faces peeked from behind windows and doors, but no one dared approach. There was a weight in the air, a tension that pressed down on everyone present. And in that charged silence, he looked at her, the faintest flicker of surprise passing over his features. The Apache did not answer immediately. He only stared, as if weighing the gravity of what she had just offered. His hands rested on the straps of his worn leather gear, the weapons at his side a reminder of the life he had chosen, a life defined by freedom, survival, and rules no outsider could ever fully understand. And yet, in that moment, something shifted. The rigid walls he had built around himself seemed to waver, bending in the face of a force more powerful than any battle he had fought. Her courage, her desperation, her willingness to surrender herself to him, called to something deep inside that he had long tried to ignore. He moved suddenly, not with the softness of gentleness, but with the certainty of inevitability. His boots struck the dirt street with a sound that echoed like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of a storm. The townspeople watched in uneasy silence as he mounted his horse, the leather reins creaking under his grip. A faint gust of wind swept through, ruffling her dress and lifting strands of her hair across her face. He did not speak. His eyes never left hers. The tension was unbearable, like the air before a thunderclap. She ran to him, the fear and longing intertwined in every step. The town seemed to blur around her, the buildings fading into a haze of dust and heat. When she reached the horse, she stopped, gripping the reins with trembling hands. "We have to leave," she whispered, but he only nodded. He was a man of few words, and yet every movement he made spoke volumes. The Apache's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the town, his expression darkening. What he saw was enough to ignite a spark that had been smoldering beneath the surface for years. The streets were filled with townspeople, their curiosity already shifting towards suspicion and fear. There were people here who would not understand the bond between them, who would seek to control, condemn, or punish, and he would not allow that. He kicked the horse into motion, and dust rose in a cloud behind them. The sound of the hooves pounding against the hard-packed dirt echoed like the tolling of a bell, signaling that the order of things was about to be overturned. The Apache's eyes were fixed on the horizon. Yet his mind raced with plans and strategies, every instinct sharpened to protect the woman who had chosen him. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the leather of his jacket. And in that instant, the world beyond their small, confining town ceased to exist. The wind carried faint smoke from the outskirts of the town, and she could smell the tang of fire before she saw it. Flames were licking at the edges of wooden fences and dry grass, growing higher with each passing second. Screams began to pierce the air, frantic and sharp, but he did not flinch. The Apache's resolve was absolute. The fire was no accident. It was a declaration, a way to ensure that no one would follow without consequence. The flames illuminated the determination in his face, casting shadows that danced across his sharp features. The woman felt a thrill of fear and excitement at the sight. Knowing that this man would stop at nothing to protect what he had claimed, the townspeople scattered in panic, banging on doors, shouting warnings, and trying to save what they could. Children clutched their mothers' skirts and men grabbed tools and weapons. Though none dared approach the figure at the center of the chaos, he was untouchable, a force beyond ordinary reckoning. And yet, despite the destruction, there was a strange beauty in the motion, the inevitability of his purpose, the raw intensity of the moment, the way it forced every hidden fear and desire to the surface as they rode toward the edges of the valley. The smoke curling behind them, the woman's heart raced, not just with fear, but with anticipation. What lay ahead was unknown, a world beyond the town that had shaped her entire life, and she would face it beside him. A man who had broken his own rules and shattered the order of the world around them simply to claim her. But there were questions that hung heavy in the air who would follow. What dangers lurked beyond the hills, and what price would be paid for this reckless, consuming choice? The Apache's hand rested briefly on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the fire, both literal and figurative. He was a man of action, not words, and yet she felt the weight of his promise in that touch. They rode into the uncertain morning, the town disappearing behind a curtain of smoke and dust. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, filled with possibilities and dangers alike. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath carried the unspoken truth. Nothing would ever be the same again, and as the first rays of sun struck the ridge ahead, the woman could only hold on, her voice caught somewhere between a prayer and a scream. The Apache's eyes were fixed ahead, unyielding and determined, and the fire behind them crackled as though echoing their resolve. The story was only beginning, and the next chapter full of peril, passion, and the testing of every limit awaited just beyond the ridge. The valley stretched wide and empty before them, a vast expanse of rolling hills and jagged ridges, dotted with scrub brush and thorny mesquite. The sun climbed higher, turning the earth to gold and shadow in equal measure. The woman, still gripping the reins tightly, could feel every muscle in the Apache's horse moving with precision, the rhythm steady, unrelenting. She had never ridden like this before. The wind tore at her hair and stung her eyes, yet she felt alive in a way she had never known. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat, every breath a reminder that the world she had known was gone, replaced by something untamed and dangerous. The Apache did not speak. Words were unnecessary. His eyes scanned the horizon constantly, sharp and unyielding, noting every rise and dip, every shadow that moved unnaturally across the landscape. He had ridden these lands since he could walk, learning their secrets from the wind, the soil, and the animals that roamed them. There was a language in the hills and the riverbeds, a map written in leaves, rocks, and the flight of birds, and he read it as easily as others read words on a page. To the woman, it was mesmerizing and terrifying. She had always thought of the world as vast, but tame. Now, she understood that there were places where even the sun dared not linger long enough to chase away the shadows as they rode. The woman finally dared to speak, her voice trembling with curiosity and fear. Why? Why did you set the town on fire? The words hung in the air, carried away quickly by the wind. He did not answer immediately. Instead, He slowed the horse just enough for her to match his pace. His eyes, dark and penetrating, met hers for a fleeting moment. "I protect what is mine," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "And no one takes it without knowing the cost." She swallowed hard. The weight of what she had done, of what she had asked, pressed down on her like the midday sun. She had spoken from fear, from desire, and from a longing she had barely understood. And now, the consequences were real and undeniable. Fires burned behind them, and though the smoke had faded into the distance, the memory of it lingered in the pit of her stomach. She had thrown herself into a world where rules were not the same as those she had grown up with, where survival meant understanding instincts sharper than her own, and she had nowhere to turn back to. Hours passed as they moved through the arid land. The landscape changed, subtly, cliffs rising jaggedly from the plain. Dry washes twisting through the brush, the distant murmur of water hinting at rivers hidden beyond the hills. The woman had questions, too many to count, but every time she tried to speak, she felt the weight of his gaze. There was a promise there, unspoken, that she was not yet ready to understand. The Apache carried secrets the land itself seemed to respect, histories he would never reveal, choices that had shaped him into the man she now rode beside. She thought of the town she had left behind. Families, neighbors, the routine of everyday life, all reduced to chaos by her own decision. The thought made her stomach twist, yet she did not regret it. There was a pull here, stronger than fear or reason, an invisible thread tying her to him, to the wild, to the uncertain road ahead. She could feel it in her bones, in the quickened beat of her heart, in the sharp inhale of breath each time the wind cut her face. It was dangerous, reckless, and exhilarating, and she would not turn away from it now. The Apache slowed as they approached a narrow canyon, the walls steep and craggy, shadows pooling at their base. He dismounted and offered her his hand, steady and strong. "Walk with me," he said. She followed, the horse obediently tied to a low boulder, and together they moved into the shade of the canyon. The air was cooler here, smelling of earth and stone, and for a brief moment the clamor of the burning town felt distant, almost unreal. He led her to a small alcove hidden by brush and rock, a place few would notice unless they were looking for it. The woman's eyes widened. It was not simply a resting place. It was a sanctuary. There were remnants of a campfire long since cooled, smooth stones shaped by years of use, and scratch marks on the rocks that told of long nights and careful observation. She realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that this was a place he had claimed, a hidden world within the wilderness that belonged entirely to him. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I am of this land. It teaches everything a man needs to know. It shows him who can survive, who cannot, and where danger hides." His gaze swept the horizon once more, as though the hills themselves whispered secrets only he could understand. "But it is not meant for everyone. You are different. That is why I bring you here." She shivered. The wind moved through the canyon like a living thing, stirring the dust and the faint scent of sage. It carried whispers from the distant world outside, a world she had abandoned but could not fully leave behind. "I don't understand," she admitted. "Why me? Why now?" He looked at her then, fully, and for the first time, the wall around him seemed to crack. There was something human in his expression, fleeting yet undeniable. A shadow of a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "Because you chose," he said simply. "Because you were brave when most would have fled. And because the world will test us both if we stay in the shadows for too long." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. She wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but a sudden rustle of movement in the canyon drew their attention. Both froze, ears straining. A hawk cried overhead, circling in wide, lazy arcs. The brush near the base of the cliff shifted. Shadows moved that had no right to be there. She felt her pulse spike, her grip tightening on the rock she leaned against. He stepped forward, silent as a shadow himself, hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his side. "Who goes there?" he called, his voice low but commanding. The response came not in words, but in the sudden scattering of small animals. The brush snapping as if someone or something had passed through moments before. The woman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the presence of the unknown. The reminder that even in this wild, open land, threats could emerge without warning, unseen and unstoppable. She wanted to run, to hide behind him. But the Apache's calm stance grounded her. "Do not fear what you cannot see," he said. "Fear what you ignore." There was a lesson in every word, though she could not yet grasp it fully. This world was harsh, relentless, and unforgiving. But it was also alive, vibrant, and filled with truths that only the brave or the desperate could ever hope to understand. Hours passed as they navigated the canyon, and the woman began to see glimpses of his life. There were traps for small animals, carefully concealed and marked. Evidence of foraging and fishing, and signs of observation, of learning from the land rather than trying to conquer it. She realized that the man she had thrown herself into was not merely wild. He was disciplined, intelligent, and utterly in tune with the world around him. The fire in the town had been chaos to outsiders, but to him, it was a strategy, a signal, declaration of intent that could not be ignored. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. The woman's breath caught. The view was breathtaking and terrifying at once, wild rivers cutting through the land, distant peaks rimmed with snow, and dark patches of forest that hid unknown dangers. She had never imagined the world could be this vast, this alive, this dangerous. The Apache dismounted again, turning to her. "Rest here," he said. "Tonight, we will move further. But you must understand something, this life is not easy. There will be choices that test you, dangers that demand everything you have, and sacrifices you cannot yet imagine. The world is not the town you left behind. Out here, only the strong, the clever, and the brave survive." She nodded, though fear and excitement warred within her. She could feel the weight of what lay ahead, the uncertainty of the road they had begun. And yet, a strange confidence rooted itself in her chest. She had chosen this path, and though she did not know its end, she would not turn back. Not now. Not ever, as the wind stirred again through the ridge, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and wild sage. The woman realized that nothing in her life had prepared her for this. And perhaps that was the point. The world ahead was wild, untamed, and dangerous. It demanded courage, loyalty, and a willingness to surrender to forces far greater than oneself. And she was ready, or at least, she would have to be. Somewhere, in the shadows of the forest below, unseen eyes were watching. The fires in the town had not gone unnoticed. Not everyone would let this theft of order stand. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting blood-red light across the land, the woman understood that her choice had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. She was no longer a bystander in life. She was part of a story much larger than herself, one that would test her, shape her, and perhaps, in the end, define her. The ridge was quiet now, but the silence carried a weight heavier than words. They would move again with nightfall, and she would have to trust him completely. Every instinct told her that danger waited, unseen but inevitable, and that the next step could change everything. She had chosen him, and now she was bound to the wild in ways she could not yet understand. Night fell over the valley with a sudden, almost cruel sharpness. Shadows crept over the jagged rocks. The cold seeped into the bones of the woman, despite the firelight that flickered between the rocks of their makeshift camp. The Apache moved with a careful precision, tending to the small fire and arranging their limited supplies. Each movement was purposeful, measured, as though he was preparing not just for the night, but for dangers he knew would come before dawn. She watched him, trying to read the lines of his face in the firelight, but there was little to grasp. He was always a man of silence, and in that silence, there were stories she would never hear unless he chose to tell them. She could not stay still. Her mind raced with questions, but also with fear. The fire behind them, the burning town they had left, was no longer a physical presence, but the echoes of it were in every shadow. In every gust of wind that rattled through the canyon, What had seemed like a choice, her choice now felt like a chain linking her to events far beyond her understanding. Her life had shifted in an instant, and the weight of that reality pressed down with every beat of her heart. The Apache noticed her unrest without her speaking. "You feel it," he said quietly. The eyes watching, the whispers in the shadows. "They will not forgive Isley." His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, and she saw the tension in his shoulders. The way he listened to a world she could not hear. Every action has a ripple. You must be ready to face them, whether you understand them now or not. She shivered, drawing her knees close to her chest. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are they coming for us now?" He shook his head slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on the darkened valley below. "Not yet, but they are out there. Those who care more for order than justice, those who fear what they cannot control, they will come. And when they do, you must not be afraid. You must understand the rules of this land." She wanted to ask more, but the words caught in her throat. There was a rawness to the way he spoke, a kind of harsh wisdom that both terrified and enthralled her. She realized she had stepped into a world where survival was not guaranteed by law or habit, but by instinct, by courage, and by knowing when to move and when to wait. The Apache lived in this world every day, and now she was tethered to it as well. As the night deepened, she thought of the town again, of the people she had left behind in confusion and anger. She wondered what stories would reach them, what rumors would spread. Some would speak of bravery, others of recklessness. She did not know which would be remembered, or if anyone would remember her at all. And yet she could not regret what she had done. There was a pull, an invisible force that had drawn her to him. She would follow it to the ends of the land if necessary. Morning arrived slowly, gray and quiet. The valley was bathed in a pale light that made the rocks glisten with frost. They moved cautiously. The woman mounted on the horse behind the Apache. Every sound seemed amplified, the snapping of a twig, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of dry brush in the wind. She felt the tension in the air, the sense that the land itself was alive, and that every step they took was watched, measured and noted hours into their journey. The Apache suddenly halted at a narrow pass between two cliffs. The woman leaned forward, trying to see what had caused him to stop, but he raised a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. His eyes scanned the ridges, and the way his muscles coiled told her instinctively that danger was near. There was no immediate threat, but he could sense it. The faintest disturbance in the wind, the almost imperceptible movement of animals. Out here, even the slightest sign could mean life or death. "They are close," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not human, not yet, but you will feel them soon." The woman's heart raced. "What are they?" "Hunters," he replied, glancing at her briefly. "And not all of them wear weapons, you can see. Some hunt with whispers, some with fear. They will try to separate us, to turn the land itself against us. That is why you must stay close, listen, and remember what I show you." She nodded, though uncertainty churned within her. The Apache's world was far larger than she had imagined. She had known wilderness, yes, and hardship, but never a life lived entirely on the edge, where every shadow carried meaning and every silence was charged with warning. She realized she was learning quickly, though, and there was no time to pause. Survival demanded attention, and attention demanded courage. As they descended the pass, a figure appeared on a ridge ahead. At first, it seemed a man like any other, riding cautiously through the hills. But the Apache stiffened immediately, his horse tensing under him. He guided the woman behind a boulder, crouching low and surveying the figure with a meticulous eye. The man was not alone. Shadows shifted behind rocks and in the trees, suggesting companions hiding, waiting. The Apache's hand rested on the hilt of his knife again. The woman felt a surge of both fear and awe at his instinctive preparedness. "They are scouting," he whispered. "Not yet ready to strike, but they watch, learn, and plan. We must move carefully. One wrong step, and the path becomes theirs." The woman understood then that the fires in the town had not simply caused panic. They had sent a signal, a challenge that would draw attention from far and near. There were those who would see them as thieves, invaders, or threats, and others who would see them as prey. and all of them were skilled, patient, and ruthless in their own ways. She realized the road ahead would not just be about survival, it would be about outthinking, outmaneuvering, and outlasting those who sought to control the narrative of her life. Hours passed as they moved through hidden trails and rocky gullies, the woman clinging to the horse and to him, learning without speaking, absorbing every lesson the land offered. She began to see the logic in his actions, the traps set along the trail, the marks in the rocks indicating safe footing, the hidden paths that led around potential ambushes. It was a language she had never known existed, and yet she found herself understanding it instinctively. Her respect for him grew, mingled with a fear that never fully dissipated. He was not just a protector. He was a master of survival, a man who had made the wilderness part of himself. And now he was teaching her to do the same. In the late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a river, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. A stark contrast to the arid land they had crossed. The Apache led her down to the edge of the river, where they stopped to rest, drink, and consider the next move. He gestured to the water, then to the far bank, silently conveying that they would have to cross, but not without caution. Every detail mattered: currents, rocks, and hidden depths all posed threats. Even here, the land demanded respect. Mistakes could be fatal. As she watched him survey the river, she realized the complexity of the world he inhabited. It was not just wilderness. It was a chessboard of danger, strategy, and survival, and every person, animal, or force had a role to play. The fires in the town had been one move. The unseen hunters on the ridge had been another. And now, every step they took would ripple through the landscape in ways she could barely imagine. Night approached again, the sky darkening into deep blues and purples, stars emerging like distant eyes. They set camp near the river, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to twitch with hidden movement. Every sound made her startle. The Apache remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the terrain constantly, listening to what the wind and the water whispered. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and unrelenting. And she understood that the world outside the canyon was full of threats she could not yet see. And yet, beneath the fear there was a strange exhilaration. The unknown stretched before them, dangerous and wide, but alive with possibility. She had thrown herself into this life willingly. Though she could not know what would come, she had begun to understand the rules. Trust, vigilance, courage, and the ability to read the land and those who moved through it were all that stood between survival and disaster. The night deepened. Somewhere upstream, the faint crackle of movement suggested another presence, unseen but close. The woman shivered, holding her cloak tighter, and the Apache's hand rested briefly on hers, not a gesture of comfort, but of readiness, a silent reminder that they faced this together. The river whispered below them, the wind rattled through the trees, and the darkness beyond promised challenges that would test everything they knew. Tomorrow, the next step would come, and the hunters, the unknown forces, and the consequences of her choice would all close in, relentless and inevitable. She had no answers, only the understanding that survival required more than courage, it demanded awareness, skill, and the unwavering will to face whatever lay ahead. Dawn arrived slow and heavy, the sky painted in bruised purples and golds. The river flowed silently below, reflecting light that seemed too gentle for the tension that hung in the air. The woman awoke to the sound of the Apache moving around the camp, his steps quiet but deliberate. His eyes scanned the terrain even as he prepared a small breakfast. His instincts always alert to threats invisible to anyone else. She watched him, sensing the weight of what was coming. There was a storm in the distance, not weather, but a storm of choices, danger, and consequences that could not be avoided. They crossed the river at first light, careful and deliberate. The water was icy, rushing with hidden currents that could sweep a person away if they were careless. Every footfall was calculated, every movement precise. She had grown more confident, learning to trust his judgment and her own instincts, but the tension never lifted. The land itself seemed alive with anticipation, as though it too knew that the next hours would test everything they had. Hours passed in a tense march across ridges and dry plains. The woman kept her eyes peeled, aware of every sound, the snap of a branch, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft footfalls of animals moving through the brush. She had begun to notice subtle signs of human presence, as well scrapes in the soil, shadows that didn't belong to nature, and the faintest trails that led in unexpected directions. The Apache noticed these too, guiding her silently, teaching her without words. The way one might teach a child to read a language written in the wind. By midday, they reached a plateau that overlooked a small valley. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, curling in thin wisps, like fingers reaching toward the sky. The woman's heart tightened. The town they had left burned in rumor and memory, but here there was a new sign of life and danger. The Apache scanned the valley with narrowed eyes. "They are here," he said simply. And she understood the truth in the brevity of his words. The figure of a man emerged from behind a ridge, followed by two others. They moved with purpose, watching, learning, and waiting. The Apache crouched behind a rock, the woman following suit. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he measured distance, shadow, and potential escape. "Not yet," he whispered. "We wait for the right moment. They are patient, but so are we." Her stomach churned. The fire they had left behind had been only the beginning. Now, she realized, their choice had set forces into motion they could not control. The men in the valley were not the only ones pursuing them. Somewhere in the shadows, there were other silent hunters who watched without moving, who calculated and planned. Every rustle of brush, every bird taking flight, every crack of a twig made her flinch. She was learning the world as he knew it, one where fear could be a weapon, but an awareness could save your life. The day stretched long and grueling. The plateau offered little cover, forcing them to move cautiously. Each step became a negotiation with the land itself, every shadow a potential threat. They skirted cliffs, hid behind boulders, and crawled through low scrub to avoid detection. The woman could feel the strain, the growing weight of anticipation that pressed down like a physical force. Every moment was an exercise in patience and discipline, and yet she could not stop the rising fear coiling in her chest. By late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron. The Apache halted abruptly, his hand pointing toward a narrow pass ahead. The woman followed his gaze. There, partially hidden by rocks and shadow, were signs of recent passage footprints pressed into the soil, remnants of campfire ashes, broken twigs. Someone had been there, watching, waiting, preparing. The air seemed charged, heavy with threat. "They are closer than I thought," he murmured, his voice low but sharp. The woman swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "How many are there?" "Enough," he replied, "and more than you realize." His eyes swept the surrounding hills, noting every fold, every ridge, every place where danger could lurk unseen. "We must move now. They will test us, push us, and try to divide us. We do not let them." They descended into the narrow pass, the walls of rock pressing close on either side. The canyon was shadowed, silent but for the faint whisper of wind through crevices. Every step was careful, deliberate, yet the tension was unrelenting. The woman felt as if she could hear every heartbeat, every breath. Every movement in the world around her amplified 100 times. Her senses were sharpened by fear, by anticipation, and by the knowledge that the next encounter could change everything. As they rounded a bend, the first sound reached them, a whistle, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the canyon. The Apache froze instantly, his body coiled like a spring. He signaled the woman to crouch lower. From above, figures began to appear on the rocks, moving silently but deliberately. The hunters were not alone. Others had joined them, emerging from hidden paths, each one skilled, patient, and prepared. The woman could feel the pressure mounting, the invisible hand of fate guiding her steps toward a confrontation she could not yet see. "Stay close," he whispered. "Do exactly as I show you. Do not move until I say. The land will protect us if we respect it." The woman nodded, fear and resolve intermingling. Every instinct screamed that this was more dangerous than anything she had faced, yet she felt a strange calm in following him. He was the center of her world now, and his actions were the only certainty in a landscape otherwise full of unknowns. She realized that survival would not come from courage alone, but from trust, timing, and understanding the rules of a world that demanded everything. The figures above moved closer. Silent, their shadows stretching long across the canyon walls. The woman's pulse raced, every nerve alive with tension. The Apache shifted slightly, repositioning himself, and she followed, her body moving as though by instinct rather than thought. She had grown in these days, learning to read the land, the air, the subtle signs of threat. But even with knowledge, even with skill, the magnitude of what awaited them was undeniable. Suddenly, stone tumbled from the upper ridge, clattering loudly against the canyon floor. The woman flinched. The Apache's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the hilt of his knife. The whistle came again, sharper this time, followed by a low murmur of voices. The hunters were coordinating, testing their patience, watching for the slightest mistake. The woman felt her stomach knot. The confrontation they had been preparing for was imminent, and there was no turning back. The Apache moved her to a small recess in the rock, almost invisible unless one was looking directly. "Here," he whispered. "We wait. They will come to us if we do not move first. The land will give us the advantage, but only if we respect it."
Hours seemed to pass in tense silence.
The woman could feel every sound amplified, the rush of wind, the distant call of birds, the faint rustle of brush that hinted at movement. Shadows shifted in ways that suggested more than natural causes, and the sense of impending confrontation grew heavier with every moment. She realized that this was a test not just of skill, but of courage, patience, and understanding the subtle rules of survival. As twilight approached, the figures above became more active. Torches appeared in the distance, flickering against the rocks. The hunters had decided to press forward, to flush them out. The Apache's posture stiffened, and he gestured for the woman to hold still. "Now," he said softly, and every instinct in her body screamed that what came next would demand everything they had learned. The torches moved closer, casting long, dancing shadows across the canyon walls. The sound of whispers, commands, and movement grew louder. The woman could feel the pulse of the hunters, a rhythm of anticipation, malice, and strategy. She understood fully now that this confrontation was not just about them. It was about every choice they had made, every ripple of fire and escape, every signal they had sent into the land. The stakes were absolute, and the outcome unknown. The Apache's eyes scanned the shadows, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to act. The woman could feel her own muscles tighten, ready to respond at his slightest signal. Every sense was alert. Every thought focused on survival. Every heartbeat carried the tension of what was to come. The night deepened. The torches approached, and the whispers became more distinct. The canyon seemed to shrink around them, pressing in with the weight of inevitable confrontation. She could feel the heat of adrenaline, fear, and anticipation coursing through her. The Apache's hand brushed hers, a silent acknowledgement of trust and readiness. They were not alone, yet they were together. And in that unity lay their only hope. Above, the hunters paused at the canyon entrance. A murmur passed among them. The Apache's eyes flicked upward, and she felt the tension spike so sharply it was almost unbearable. The moment of reckoning was close. Every choice, every lesson, every movement of the day led to this instant. The shadows, the fire, the whispers, all converged toward a single point of confrontation that would demand courage, precision, and every ounce of trust between them. And as the torches drew closer, the woman realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that nothing in her life had ever prepared her for what was coming. The clash, the test, the ultimate confrontation with the hunters and with the consequences of their choices loomed over them like a storm on the horizon. Every heartbeat, every breath, every nerve in her body screamed that the climax of their journey was at hand, and that the land, the hunters, and the Apache himself held secrets and power she was only beginning to understand. The shadows shifted once more. The torches glinted in the deepening dark, and the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The woman clutched the Apache's arm tightly, ready for whatever came next. The night, the land, and the hunters waited with silent patience, and she knew, in a way that left no room for doubt, that there would be no turning back from this moment. The night seemed to hold its breath as the torches neared the canyon. The hunters' whispers grew louder, mingling with the faint rustle of the wind through the rocks. The woman gripped the Apache's arm, feeling the steady pulse of his body beneath her hands, his presence a tether to courage and certainty in the midst of chaos. Every movement, every decision, every breath had led to this moment. She could feel the culmination of their journey, the weight of choice and consequence pressing down, demanding clarity, strength, and action. The Apache shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the shadows. He had learned long ago to anticipate movement before it occurred, to read the slightest changes in the wind, the air, and the ground. The hunters, confident in their approach, did not see the subtle traps and indicators he had set days before. Every rock, every ridge, every loose stone had a purpose. He whispered instructions in a voice low enough for her to hear, guiding her movements, reminding her to trust her instincts. The first torchbearer stepped too close to a narrow ledge, and the Apache acted with lightning precision. A small, well-aimed rock dislodged from the ridge above, tumbling toward the hunter with a sudden, deafening crash. He stumbled, caught off balance, and the sound of his fall echoed sharply through the canyon. The other hunters froze, realizing too late that they were in a terrain they did not fully understand. Where the land itself had been claimed and readied by a master of survival, the woman's heart raced as the remaining hunters advanced. But the Apache moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible in the confined space. He guided her behind rocks, through narrow crevices, and along hidden paths she would never have noticed alone. Every movement was calculated, every choice deliberate. She felt a growing confidence within herself, a realization that she had changed, adapted, and learned in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer simply following. She was participating, surviving, and understanding. The hunters regrouped at the canyon entrance, their voices rising in frustration and strategy. The Apache studied them carefully, noting their patterns, their coordination, and their reliance on numbers over skill. He saw opportunity in their mistakes, in their impatience, and he seized it. A carefully timed distraction sent a plume of dust rolling down a slope, obscuring their vision. The woman felt the rush of wind and the subtle shift of balance as he led her down a narrow passage unseen by their pursuers. Time seemed to stretch. Every sound, every movement, every flicker of torchlight heightened the tension. And yet there was a strange rhythm to the chaos. The woman realized she had come to trust not only the Apache, but herself. She noticed patterns, cues, and risks. She had learned the language of survival, the silent dialogue between hunter, hunted, and land. And she understood that courage was not merely an action, but an awareness, patience, and decisive choice, as they emerged from the narrow pass into a wide expanse. The hunters had split, seeking different paths to flank them. The Apache signaled for the woman to move ahead, carefully guiding her to higher ground. From this vantage point, they could see the full scope of the pursuit. The hunters' torches flickered like scattered stars, moving cautiously through the rocks, unaware of the traps and natural barriers that lay between them and their target. The Apache's face, set in a mask of determination, finally relaxed for a moment as he glanced at her. "You have learned quickly," he said, and the words carried more weight than any lesson could. "Do not forget this moment. Remember how the land, the fire, and the choices you make can be your allies if you respect them." She nodded, feeling the truth of it in every fiber of her being. She had come far from the frightened girl who had first cried for him in the town street. She had grown, adapted, and survived. And that growth would carry her beyond this night. The hunters began to regroup, sensing the terrain was turning against them. The Apache struck with precision, using sudden movements and well-placed distractions to further confuse and scatter them. Rocks tumbled, hidden gullies, forced detours, and narrow passes blocked the pursuit. Every maneuver showcased his mastery, yet it was also a test for her, a moment for her to apply what she had learned. She moved with awareness, watching the land, noting every sound, every shadow, every shift in the hunter's approach. When the last of the hunters finally realized they were being outmaneuvered, they called for retreat, their confidence broken and fear evident. The Apache did not pursue. He allowed them to leave, understanding that victory was not in destruction, but in survival and knowledge. The woman exhaled, the tension finally easing from her shoulders as she realized the immediate danger had passed. Yet the lessons, the awareness, and the consequences remained. They descended from the high ground into a quiet valley, the air now carrying the faint scent of sage and river water. The woman felt the tension in her body loosen, though her mind remained alert. She had been tested in fire, in pursuit, and in the unforgiving land itself, and she had survived. Every fear, every doubt, every heartbeat of the past days had led her. To this moment of clarity, the Apache finally allowed her a moment to sit by the river's edge, where the water reflected the stars overhead. He remained near, ever watchful, but there was a quiet in his movements, a sense of completion that had been absent before. "You have faced much," he said quietly, "and you have endured. Remember this strength that will guide you through every choice yet to come." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and newfound understanding. "I was afraid," she admitted, "but I learned. I understand now, at least a little. The land, the choices, the danger, they are all part of living. I feel alive," he nodded, a faint shadow of a smile passing across his face. "That is the way. Fear is not weakness. It is a guide. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward despite it. Remember that. And remember, we are shaped not only by what we survive, but by what we choose to protect." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft rush of the river and the distant call of a night bird. The woman reflected on the journey, the fires in the town, the hunters in the canyon, and the choices that had brought them here. Every moment of danger had revealed something essential about the land, about the Apache, and about herself. She had grown, not just in skill, but in understanding, resilience, and trust. The first light of morning began to touch the valley, painting the river in gold and shadow. The land seemed calm, almost peaceful after the tension of the previous days. The Apache stood and gestured for her to follow. They moved slowly, carefully, toward a hidden path leading deeper into the wilderness. The fires, the pursuit, the immediate danger were behind them, but the journey was not over. The woman realized that life in this untamed world was ongoing. Each day a test, each choice a challenge, and each horizon full of unknowns. She glanced at him, feeling the bond that had been forged in fire, fear, and trust. "Where do we go from here?" she asked. He looked out over the valley, the wind stirring his hair. "Forward," he said simply. "Always forward. The land will teach, the challenges will come, and we will face them as we have, together." As they moved into the morning light, the woman understood that the story was no longer just about survival. It was about freedom, trust, and the choices that define who we are. The fires in the town had been a spark, the hunters a test, and the land a guide. She had been forged in the tension of fear and courage, and now she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The valley stretched endlessly before them, live with possibility, danger, and promise. Every ridge, every river bend, every shadow held lessons yet to be learned. The Apache led the way, silent but resolute, and she followed with a confidence that had grown from the trials they had endured. She knew that life in this wilderness would never be simple, but it was real, vibrant, and hers to claim. The river flowed on. The wind whispered through the rocks, and the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the land. The woman breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of what was to come. She had faced fire, hunters, and fear itself. She had chosen the wild, and in doing so, had discovered the strength to survive, the wisdom to trust, and the courage to embrace a life that was utterly and completely her own. And as they disappeared into the distant hills, the valley held its quiet watch. knowing that the story of courage, trust, and the bond between them would continue, written in the land, the wind, and the heartbeats of those willing to face it.